The agenda this week probed the opioid crisis in the province, debated development in the capital city, and explored the housing challenges facing seniors. The agenda's week in review begins asking whether climate change might upend our traditional notions of national sovereignty. Alan Rock, let's get you started here. Why do you believe the Amazon fire requires international intervention regardless of Brazil's personal sovereign interests here?
Well, the world has long since acknowledged that sovereignty is not absolute. That is to say that you cannot simply close your borders and do whatever you want within them. 15 years ago, the General Assembly unanimously agreed on the principle that if a country is slaughtering its own people or standing by while others do so within its own borders, the international community has an obligation to do something about it. That put an asterisk on sovereignty for the first time. I think this is another example of the need for such an asterisk. That is to say, there's now a global consensus that climate change is an existential threat to the world. Everybody has to do their part around the world to meet that challenge. And if one country puts a global asset like the rainforest at risk, which could have a meaningful impact on our collective effort to save the globe, then the international community must respond, not necessarily with troops. As in the case of mass atrocities, you start with economic sanctions, with measures that will bring pressure to bear upon the government. Intervention is only the last resort. But the principle is the same, it seems to me, where there's a globally acknowledged goal, an expectation that each individual country will do its part, and an outlier, a rogue state refusing, endangering the achievement of the overall goal. The international community has the right and indeed the obligation to do something about it.
Okay, that's the thesis. Let's get some feedback from others on that. Let me ask, first of all, your conservative friend sitting beside you. Gary, what do you think of this view?
Well, look, I appreciate the viewpoint that Mr. Rock has brought forward, and I'm sure he brings it forward in a spirit of goodwill and good meaning, but I kind of feel like it's a little bit of clickbait for the commentary pages. We've seen the responsibility to protect doctrine be adopted by the UN, but in recent times, and trying to fit this into the environmental lens, the whole issue of responsibility to protect hasn't been so successful. We've tried it in Libya, and that has not been a huge success in the outcome in Libya. And we haven't been able to enact it in other places in the Syrian civil war, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's the plight of the Rohingya population in Burma. Look, the Brazilian government has faced a lot of pressure. Canada has offered $15 million in aid and firefighting equipment, and that appears to have been accepted by the Bolsonaro government. The Chilean government has offered some aid, and the Israelis are sending firefighters. What has actually happened with the news story after Bolsonaro rejected the first proposal of aid is that he's been feeling pressure on his own population, and he is starting to accept aid. So I think using the pressure of the multilateral system and a bilateral system to encourage him to accept assistance has started to help. He's even put in a freeze on starting any new fires, which is a start. It's a step in the right direction. And it's not just in Brazil where there are issues. Bolivia next door, Evo Morales has encouraged clearing land by fire. So I think it's a bit of a step too far, and I think we should try to use the multilateral and the bilateral systems that we have around the world in situations like this.
Let me pick up on that with Teresa. Teresa, do you think there risks a local populist backlash in Brazil if the international community were to intervene against Brazil's wishes?
Yeah, I think that the big concern here is that we are banking on a system, on a policy that is predicated on multilateralism. And multilateralism, both of my colleagues here are advocating one form or another of multilateralism. Multilateralism is just not working very well, as we know. I mean, it's barely on life support in many environmental areas. So I don't think it's practical, and I also think that it can incite a sort of feeding into this discourse from the Bolsonaro government, which is, we're facing the developed nations who are telling us we can't develop the way they did. There's a whole climate justice debate, and there's a whole pitting of environment versus development in the Brazilian discourse that Bolsonaro is tapping into, and I think that this will accentuate that. So I don't think it's the right policy tool at all.
If we go to 2016, there was a 19% increase in the number of deaths because of opioids compared with the previous year, 2015. And then if you go to 2017, there was a 46% jump over the previous year. If you go to 2018, another 16% jump. That's a total of 1,473 deaths last year. If we look at this year, we have stats available from January to March, and there's already a 3% increase compared with the previous 3 months, October to December, at the end of 2018. The graph continues to go up and up and up and up. Chief Coroner, what do those numbers mean to you?
First off, I just want to recognize that the numbers are representative of a person. So every count is one person who's lost their lives, the family have lost their loved one, the community has suffered a loss, the care providers have all suffered a loss. So I don't want to ever lose that. But certainly when we talk about numbers, it seems to get lost, the individuals. But what this means to me is this is one of the most significant public health problems that we have in Ontario history, certainly in recent times.
In history?
Yes.
So this is not just a today problem. You think this has historic implications?
This is a tremendous loss of lives, and each of the lives that is lost is a preventable loss of life, and often it's involving upwards of 50% of the deaths involve those between 25 and 44. So these are young people whose lives are being taken very early in their young lives.
We don't have an overdose task force in this province anymore. We had one that ran during the Liberal government, but the Conservative government decided not to reconvene it. So we haven't met in well over a year. During SARS, they had phone calls every day. They had meetings weekly. We had flu pandemic planning. There was all sorts of things that happened that just have not happened in the overdose crisis. There's no one to talk to. There's no one to call and who's in charge of this crisis in this province. If you were to ask people in the Conservative government who's in charge, you will get probably a few different answers. And that's really problematic because we have this crisis raging on, and we need people to be in charge, and we need to be taking it really seriously. You know, I know that the overdose prevention sites, which are now called consumption and treatment services in Toronto, you know, they reversed over 2,000 overdoses from their establishment in August of 2017 till like a few months ago is the latest statistics that I saw. That is so many overdoses reversed, and there are communities that really want to build these structures to help them with these emergencies. It's just not happening. It's not happening fast enough. And there just isn't enough on the ground. And I will say, as a worker, this has been really challenging to work in this. To work in this and to just see like a total disregard for human life. And these are like people that we know, and there are people advocating and fighting, like Moms Stop the Harm, like moms who are out there fighting for other people's children because they've lost their children. These are preventable deaths. This is accidental. And that's why politicians are also responsible, because their policies are why we have fentanyl, because border security couldn't stop the flow of drugs, and there is a supply and demand. And if you take people off of their pain medication, which is safe, people are going to look for what they need to deal with their pain. So it's all of these things combined. And so there is a responsibility that lies at the foot of all of these people that we put in charge, that we pay for them to be in charge at different levels of government to deal with this crisis, and it just hasn't happened.
Would an opioid czar at the cabinet table make a difference?
Yes, I think Zoe should just take on that role. I think perhaps, I mean, it's hard to say, but I do think that we need that attention at the policy level, but we also need to talk to people on the ground. I think just having a czar who thinks that they have a sense of the complexity of this issue and
who
can
coordinates all the response? That's the idea.
Potentially. So, I mean, I think it depends the approach that person takes and whether they only listen to other people within government, whether they talk with the clinical community, people in harm reduction, people with lived experience. So, it's really hard to know until you design a model that takes into account the complexity of this issue and the fact that a lot of the time, what people say are unintended consequences of some of these policies that have come out were predicted by people on the ground who are living it. And so had policymakers, perhaps researchers like myself and others, been more proactive and spoken with people with lived experience, perhaps we could have avoided a lot of this harm by developing better policy, by better contextualizing the data and the research. And so I think that's the direction that people like Dirk, that people like myself are trying to take moving forward, is to say we can learn so much by talking with people who are living this right now. And we really need to work with them and help bring those conversations up to whoever it is that is in a position to make change, because that hasn't been happening in the past.
My hunch is you're not the problem, though. So what is the problem?
Well, I think the problem is that, other people who are in a position to make change, I am personally not, unfortunately, aren't taking that approach. And there has been this shift as well, away from, some ground that have been made in terms of talking with people through task forces, through other ways to try and understand that experience. And I think we need to reinvigorate that, and we need to make sure that that's integrated throughout the policy discussions that are occurring.
Do you think you are an obstacle to the kind of growth that we need in order to accommodate the numbers of people who are going to move here?
Absolutely not. And I think it's almost laughable to even suggest that this is political interference on behalf of the councillors and myself, when we know that the unilateral decision that came from Queen's Park, 224 changes to the Teal Core, which is City of Toronto's new 25-year secondary plan, and that they did not have political interference. That political influence was powerful. The development lobby has been all over Queen's Park. The changes that came out of the Teal Core amendments had everything to do with what the development lobby wanted. So to even suggest that the councillors downtown who are trying to protect and defend the public process that came out of Teal Core is, I would say, incredulous.
Eileen, how do you see it?
Well, I see it as a complex issue, but I think I'd start with this notion of it being a unilateral interference by the provincial government. I think what we need to step back and recognize is that City Council made a determination to advance their official plan amendments to the province for review and approval. They didn't need to make that decision. They made that decision because they thought it would make those planning instruments immune from appeal by individual developers. So it wasn't a unilateral decision. It was a decision that the City of Toronto put to the province. They said, please review our plan and approve it. The province is obligated under the Planning Act, when doing that, to make sure that the plan they're approving conforms with provincial policy and conforms with legislation. That's in the Planning Act as well. So this occurred right at the same time that Bill 108 was coming out. Bill 108 is really an omnibus bill, which is changing core pieces of legislation in the province: the Planning Act, the Development Charges Act, the Heritage Act. And so there was a necessary step that had to be taken to take these plans and bring them into alignment with provincial policy. That's mandated by law. So it's not unilateral, and it's politically interfering in as much as the growth plan was political interference when that was brought in, over a decade ago, and other municipalities in the 905 screamed and said, we don't want the province setting growth targets for us. Provinces do this. They bring forward provincial legislation, and we may find it challenging in the City of Toronto that we're a creature of the province and that we have to conform, but that's the way this works.
People in my business, though, are always looking for villains. Is there a villain in this tale?
I think if there's a villain, it's the fact that we've been slow to respond to the pace of growth in Toronto for over a decade. I've been practicing as a lawyer for about 15 years. I've never seen the kind of sustained level of growth that we've seen in the last sort of 7 to 10 years.
Because it's probably never happened.
It's never happened before. But what we didn't have in place at the time was, I think, a mechanism to respond efficiently and effectively at the municipal level to that amount of growth. I don't think there's any debate that we've got a housing issue in Toronto. I don't think there's any debate that we have an affordability issue in Toronto. What concerns me is we're here today debating red light, green light, and what I'd love to talk about is what's the green light? What are we actually going to do at the municipal level to incentivize and to move things forward? Because I can get a development approval to council very quickly. I've worked with this councillor in particular on some of that, and I get my approval, and then I'm still waiting 12 months, 18 months, sometimes 2 years to get through the process at the city staff level.
We will figure out why in a second.
Yeah.
Is he any good to deal with, incidentally?
He's terrific to deal with.
He is, eh?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, he is.
So apparently you're not as obstreperous or objectionable as some others think you are.
Well, I hope not.
How do you see
I
this?
think that's a question.
I hope not.
How do you see this issue?
Well, let me take a step back and talk about downtown. So in 2001, the population of downtown Toronto, 17 square kilometers in size, was 115,000 people. Today, the population of downtown is 250,000 people. It's more than doubled in just over 15 years. In the next 25 years, we expect the population of downtown to double yet again to 500,000 people. And so TO Core was the very first master plan developed for downtown Toronto since David Crombie was mayor in 1976. For the first time since the 1970s, over an 8-year period, the City of Toronto, our expert staff, city councillors, Councillor Wong Tam and myself, members of the public, we created a plan to guide future growth. We want growth downtown, and it's coming. But unless that growth includes the infrastructure to support it, hard infrastructure, sewers, hydro, water, social infrastructure, community centers, parks, childcare, unless you build that infrastructure, that growth isn't livable, it's not sustainable, and it jeopardizes our actual prosperity. And so in June, the province announced 224 changes to our plan, a plan that we created over 8 years. Changes that threaten that livability.
There's a lot of research out there that really recognizes that loneliness is a killer in the long term. Loneliness, there's also that related to that is the safety issue. Just to make there's somebody around to make sure that you wake up in the morning or to alert the authorities if you don't. That's really nice to know. But loneliness, yeah, that's I think a big driver. Really.
And why was it not an option for you to do what many other people obviously do, which is to move into some kind of retirement residence or that kind of thing?
I could have, and really what motivated our move in this direction was watching my mom move into a retirement home in Port Perry, which was wonderful for her. She loved it. It kind of creeped me out, to tell the truth.
What about it creeped you out?
Just the forced togetherness. So she was having dinner with people that she didn't choose to necessarily have dinner with every day, and activities that you were encouraged to go to that you might not have wanted to, and I didn't want to be that organized. And if I was going to have meatloaf on Tuesday, I wanted that to be my choice, that I was having meatloaf on Tuesday. So it was around getting control. It was also the cost, though. That was the original driver, really. When I was researching places for my mom, I asked how much retirement homes were going up every year and asked for the history. And they seemed to, at that point, have been going up 3% a year. So having a math background, I took a look at what it was going to cost my mom, thought of myself maybe 20 years out, what that would be, and did the calculation and realized it wasn't in the cards. I was not going to be able to afford that, unless you know for sure you're going to die quick. I've got this death thing going on, but you really, if at that stage my mom looked like she was going to live to be 100, and I wasn't going to be able to afford a retirement home for that kind of time.
Is the plan for you and your 3 housemates to be in that house for the rest of your lives?
That's the plan. Now, we also recognize there could be other, if there are health issues that mean you have to move out, that's one thing. We also recognize there could be personality changes as people age. So that's all part of our legal agreement, and people in that case could be kind of voted off the island.
Well, that's what I wondered. Like if somebody gets dementia, for example,
yeah.
Are the other 3 expected to care for that person?
No, we haven't signed up to be each other's caregivers. We have designed the house in a way that would allow us to have live-in care if we wanted to. And the deal is if you need care, you pay for it. And we're sort of hoping, because we're similar ages, that when that happens, at least 2 people will need care. And that's, again, an opportunity to share that cost as well. So if all goes well, yes, we would stay in the house. We would bring in more care as time moves on, and hopefully die there. Yeah.
Speaking of bringing in, what happens if one of you meets somebody and wants to get married? Is the new husband or wife or whatever allowed to move in with?
As long as the other people are happy with that individual, then we could absolutely. We've talked that through, and right now none of us are involved with anybody, but that would be okay too. To have the occasional overnight guest, that would be just fine. God willing, it would ever happen.
recent CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Report, found that seniors are staying in their family-sized homes for longer. They are downsizing later than perhaps in earlier days. What are the implications, in your view, of that?
Yeah, so I don't think anyone will be surprised that older adults are staying longer in their family homes. A home is a feeling, and we all want to be home. I was reflecting when Bianca Andrescu arrived in Mississauga. She said, what do I want to do? I want to go to my bed and sleep in my bed. But the implications become multifold, and you mentioned a few of them in your opening. So first is sometimes because they're drawing a home and the community around that home, that housing might not be the most appropriate for their needs or for their finances. But what the CMHC report also shows is there are not other options available. And that's a lot of where now the policy discussions are going.
To find some options that are available.
In their community.
In their community. Cheryl, how would you answer that? The implications of people staying at home for longer?
Well, the implications of that is in the GTA, there are 5 million empty bedrooms. And what that means is not that the seniors, again, have to move out, but that does point again to the fact that, the housing supply isn't reflecting the needs of the population.
5 million empty bedrooms.
Yeah.
So this is a situation where kids have moved out, maybe, a senior woman, widow is the last person there. She's staying in her original home, and there's 2 or 3 empty bedrooms where everybody else used to live. So that's really, do you think of that as wasted space in some respects?
I think it's a symptom of a system that is not responding to current needs. So in the cases where I've heard of people actually downsizing, they did that because they had options in their local neighborhood where they could do so, right? So where you're seeing households and seniors not downsizing, they don't have options to downsize in their local neighborhood, maintain those relationships with their community. So that's why they stay where they are, because why leave when you don't have to, and when leaving is not really even an option.
Is that right, Dr. Zena? Leaving just not an option for many of these people?
Well, I think it goes back to what Zena also said at the beginning, was that that home is not just the house that you live in, for example, but it's also your neighborhood, it's your community. And when you don't have those other options, for example, if there's not an apartment building, in your own neighborhood, for example, if there aren't other housing options, then why would I move out of my house and give up my neighborhood and my community? That store that I love to go to, my local church, other things in my community, maybe my community group, because in order to get the housing I need, it means I have to leave an entire community behind. And I think that's the problem. But, this report, it's like surprise, surprise, right? Life expectancy in Canada in 1900 was 51 years of age. It's now 82. And if you make it to 65, and most of us will, you'll have 20 years of good, life expectancy ahead of you. And that's something to celebrate. So yes, of course, if you're healthy and living longer, why would you need to move out of your house? But I think this is where we're blaming an issue about a lack of housing stock and now picking on this group, saying, how dare they live so long and successfully and choose to live in their homes longer? How dare they?
And that's just some of what we covered this week on the agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website. That's tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed. That's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.